Have you ever wondered about the forgotten son of Adam and Eve, the one whose story holds the key to understanding humanity's second chance? While most people know about Cain and Abel, there's a third son whose narrative has been overshadowed by his brother's dramatic tale. His name was Seth, and his story isn't just another biblical footnote. It's the untold foundation of everything that came after. Seth wasn't just a replacement child born to grieving parents. He was chosen before the world began to carry a sacred bloodline that would stretch from the Garden of Eden all the way to the Messiah himself. But here's what most people don't realize. Seth's birth marked the moment when God decided to give humanity a second chance, and the ripple effects of that decision are still shaping our world today. You see, after Abel's blood cried out from the ground and Cain was marked as a wanderer, it seemed like God's plan for humanity had been shattered. The first family was broken, the covenant bloodline appeared to be severed, and darkness had triumphed over light. But then something extraordinary happened. Something that would change the entire trajectory of human history. In this video, we're going to uncover the hidden significance of Seth's life, explore the profound prophecies connected to his lineage, and reveal how this forgotten son became the anchor of hope for all mankind. I'm going to show you details from ancient texts that most people have never heard, connections that will blow your mind, and revelations that might just transform how you see the entire biblical narrative. But before we dive deep into this incredible story, I need to warn you, what you're about to discover challenges everything you thought you knew about the early chapters of Genesis. The truth about Seth isn't just fascinating, it's life-changing. So if you're ready to embark on this journey with me, drop a 777 in the comments, hit that like button, and let's explore the untold story together. Now let me take you back to a moment of unimaginable grief. Picture Eve, the mother of all living, holding her breath as she feels new life stirring within her womb. This wasn't her first pregnancy, but it carried a weight unlike any before. She had already buried one son and lost another to exile. The joy of motherhood had been tainted with sorrow beyond description. When Seth finally arrived, Eve spoke words that would echo through eternity. According to Genesis 4:25, she declared, "God has appointed me another offspring in place of Abel because Cain killed him." But that simple statement carries layers of meaning that most people completely miss. The name Seth itself is a revelation. In Hebrew, it means appointed or substituted. But this wasn't just any appointment. This was a divine appointment, a cosmic correction, a second chance wrapped in the form of a newborn child. Eve understood something profound in that moment. She recognized that this child wasn't merely a consolation prize for her loss. He was God's answer to humanity's desperate need for redemption. Think about the spiritual implications of what was happening. The first murder had just taken place on earth. Brother had killed brother. The very fabric of human relationship had been torn apart by jealousy and rage. Evil had planted its flag in the soil of creation, and it seemed like darkness was winning. But God doesn't abandon his plans. He doesn't give up on his purposes. When one door closes, he opens another. When one vessel is broken, he prepares a new one. And in Seth, we see the first great example of God's redemptive power in action. Here's what makes this even more remarkable. Seth wasn't just born to be a replacement. He was born to be a restorer. His very existence was a declaration that God's covenant with humanity wasn't finished. The promise made in Eden that the seed of the woman would one day crush the serpent's head was still alive, and it would flow through Seth's bloodline. But let me tell you something that will absolutely astound you. The birth of Seth marked the beginning of what we might call humanity's first spiritual revival. Genesis 4:26 tells us something incredible. It says that in the days of Seth's son Enosh, People began to call upon the name of the Lord. Do you understand what this means? After the fall, after the murder, after the exile and the wandering, after it seemed like humanity had completely lost its way, worship was reborn. Prayer was restored. The connection between heaven and earth was re-established. And it all started with Seth's lineage. This wasn't coincidence. This was divine orchestration. God was weaving a story of redemption that would span millennia, and Seth was the thread that held it all together. Through him, the knowledge of God would be preserved. Through him, the promise of salvation would be carried forward. Through him, hope would survive even in the darkest hours of human history. Now here's where it gets really interesting. While Cain's descendants were building cities and advancing technology, becoming masters of the earth but forgetting their creator, Seth's line was doing something entirely different. They were becoming keepers of the flame, guardians of divine truth, protectors of the sacred covenant. Look at the genealogy in Genesis chapter 5, and you'll notice something extraordinary. Seth lived 912 years. His son Enosh lived 905 years. Kenan lived 910 years. Mahalalel lived 895 years. These weren't just long lives, they were testimonies to God's blessing resting on this particular bloodline. But it wasn't just about longevity. These men carried something precious within them. They carried the memory of Eden, the knowledge of God's character, the understanding of his promises. They were living libraries of divine revelation, passing down truth from generation to generation, through oral tradition, through ritual, through the sacred act of worship. And speaking of worship, let me tell you about one of Seth's descendants who took it to an entirely different level. His name was Enoch, and his story will leave you speechless. Genesis 5:24 says something that appears nowhere else in the early biblical narrative. It says that Enoch walked with God, and then he was no more because God took him away. Enoch didn't die. He didn't experience the corruption of the grave. He didn't taste the bitter fruit of mortality that every other human being has known. Instead, he was translated, transported, taken directly into God's presence without passing through death. This man's relationship with the Almighty was so intimate, so pure, so perfect, that heaven itself reached down and drew him home. Can you imagine what that means? Here was a descendant of Seth who achieved what Adam had lost. He walked with God in perfect communion, just like in the Garden of Eden. The fellowship that had been broken by sin was restored in one man's life. The separation between heaven and earth was bridged through the power of faith and obedience. But Enoch's translation wasn't just a personal victory, it was a prophetic sign, a glimpse into God's ultimate plan for humanity. It was proof that death wasn't the final word, that the grave wouldn't have the last say, that redemption was not only possible but certain. And here's something that will blow your mind. The book of Jude tells us that Enoch was also a prophet. He didn't just walk with God, he spoke for God. Jude 14 and 15. Record one of Enoch's prophecies, a vision of the end times when the Lord would come with his holy ones to execute judgment on the ungodly. Think about this. Thousands of years before the birth of Christ, before the giving of the law, before the calling of Abraham, a descendant of Seth was already prophesying about the second coming of Jesus. The entire sweep of redemptive history was revealed to him in vision. He saw the beginning and the end, the fall and the restoration, the judgment and the glory. This is the power of Seth's lineage. This is what made them different from every other family on earth. They weren't just survivors. They were seers. They weren't just believers. They were prophets. They carried within them the ability to perceive spiritual realities that others couldn't even imagine. But Enoch's story leads us to an even more remarkable figure in Seth's genealogy. His great-grandson, a man whose name has become synonymous with longevity and endurance. I'm talking about Methuselah, who lived longer than any other human being in recorded history. 969 years on this earth. Now, most people think of Methuselah as just a curiosity, a biblical record holder, the answer to a trivia question. But his life was so much more than that. His very name carried prophetic significance. Methuselah means, when he dies, it shall come. And what was it that would come? The flood. The great judgment that would cleanse the earth of corruption and give humanity yet another fresh start. Methuselah's extraordinarily long life wasn't just a blessing, it was a mercy. Every year he continued to breathe was another year of grace for a world spiraling toward destruction. God was literally extending time itself, holding back judgment, hoping that people would turn from their wickedness and return to him. And here's what's truly amazing. The year Methuselah died was the year the flood came. Not a coincidence, not a lucky guess, but divine timing orchestrated down to the very month and day. His death was the signal, the final warning, the last call for repentance before the waters rose. This brings us to perhaps the most important figure in Seth's lineage before we reach the flood. A man who found grace in the eyes of the Lord when the rest of humanity had become corrupt beyond measure. His name was Noah, and through him, Seth's bloodline would survive the greatest catastrophe in human history. But Noah wasn't just a boat builder or an animal collector. He was a preacher of righteousness, a voice crying in the wilderness, a final witness to a world that had forgotten its creator. For decades, while he prepared the ark, he warned people of coming judgment. He pleaded with them to turn back to God. He demonstrated through his own obedience what it meant to walk by faith. And when the floodwaters finally receded and Noah's family stepped onto dry ground, they carried with them something infinitely precious. They carried the genetic heritage of Seth, the spiritual legacy of Enoch, the prophetic wisdom of Methuselah, and the covenant promises of God himself. The rainbow that appeared in the clouds after the flood wasn't just a symbol of God's mercy. It was a reminder that Seth's mission wasn't finished. The bloodline that began with his appointment in place of Abel would continue. The promise of redemption would survive. The hope of humanity would endure. From Noah's sons, the earth would be repopulated. Nations would rise and spread across the continents. Languages would develop and civilizations would flourish. But through it all, one particular line would be preserved and protected, carrying within it the seed of promise that would one day blossom into the greatest gift ever given to mankind. That gift, that promise, that hope wrapped in human flesh, was still centuries in the future. But it was coming, as surely as the sun rises in the east. And when it arrived, it would bear the genetic heritage of Seth, the appointed son, the substitute, the one through whom God chose to give humanity its second chance. But before we trace that bloodline forward to its ultimate fulfillment, we need to understand something crucial about Seth's character that sets him apart from every other figure in early biblical history. You see, Seth wasn't just passively carrying forward a genetic legacy. He was actively shaping the spiritual destiny of mankind through choices that would echo through eternity. While Cain's descendants were mastering metallurgy and creating musical instruments, advancing human civilization through technological innovation, Seth's family was pioneering something far more revolutionary. They were developing the art of communion with the divine. They were becoming experts in the science of the soul. They were mapping territories that couldn't be conquered with swords or measured with instruments. Think about what this means for a moment. In a world where survival demanded constant attention to physical needs, where finding food and shelter consumed most of human energy, Seth's lineage was investing in something that offered no immediate material benefit. They were cultivating their relationship with an invisible God, trusting in promises they couldn't see, building their lives around faith rather than sight. This wasn't just religious activity. This was radical living. This was countercultural in the most profound sense. While the world around them was choosing immediate gratification, they chose eternal significance. While others were accumulating possessions, they were accumulating wisdom. While civilization was learning to manipulate the physical world, they were learning to commune with the spiritual realm. And here's what makes Seth's approach so remarkable. He understood that true legacy isn't found in what you accomplish during your lifetime, but in what continues after you're gone. The cities that Cain built eventually crumbled. The technologies his descendants developed were swept away by the flood. But the spiritual heritage that Seth established, that endured, that multiplied, that transformed the world. Let me paint you a picture of what life might have looked like in Seth's household. Imagine evening gatherings where stories of Eden were retold with reverent detail. Picture children learning not just practical skills for survival, but eternal truths about God's character. Envision worship services where the family would call upon the name of the Lord, offering sacrifices that acknowledged their dependence on divine grace. These weren't just family traditions. They were acts of resistance against the spiritual darkness that was engulfing the world. Every prayer was a declaration that God still mattered. Every sacrifice was a statement that sin required atonement. Every gathering was a testimony that community with the Creator was still possible. But Seth's influence extended far beyond his immediate family. Through his example, through his teaching, through his unwavering commitment to righteousness, he created a culture of faithfulness that would survive for generations. He established patterns of worship that would be refined and developed by his descendants. He planted seeds of truth that would eventually blossom into the great revelations given to the prophets. Now, let me share something with you that will absolutely revolutionize how you understand Seth's role in biblical history. Most people read Genesis and assume that the early chapters are simply historical records, interesting stories about ancient people who lived long ago. But that perspective misses the deeper spiritual realities at work. Seth wasn't just a historical figure. He was a type, a foreshadowing, a prophetic picture of something far greater that was yet to come. His appointment in place of Abel was a preview of the ultimate substitution that would one day take place on Calvary's cross. His role as the carrier of the covenant bloodline pointed forward to the one who would be called the second Adam. Do you see the parallels? Just as Seth was appointed to replace what was lost through Abel's death, Jesus would be appointed to restore what was lost through Adam's fall. Just as Seth's birth marked the beginning of a new spiritual awakening among humanity, Christ's birth would herald the dawn of a new covenant. Just as Seth's lineage preserved the promise of redemption through dark centuries, Jesus would fulfill that promise once and for all. This typological significance of Seth isn't just theological speculation. It's woven into the very fabric of Scripture itself. When Luke traces Jesus' genealogy all the way back to Adam in the 3rd chapter of his Gospel, he doesn't skip over Seth or treat him as merely another name in a long list. He includes him deliberately, recognizing that the Christ's lineage flows directly through this appointed son. But there's another layer to Seth's story that most people completely overlook. His appointment as Abel's replacement wasn't just about continuing the human race or preserving the covenant bloodline. It was about demonstrating God's power to bring life out of death, hope out of despair, purpose out of tragedy. Consider Eve's emotional state when Seth was conceived. She had already experienced the horror of watching one son murder another. She had felt the devastating grief of losing Abel, the righteous one, the one whose sacrifice was accepted by God. She had endured the shame of seeing Cain, her firstborn, banished from the family and marked as a fugitive. In the depths of that darkness, when it seemed like her family was destroyed beyond repair, God planted new life in her womb. Not just any life, but appointed life, chosen life, redemptive life, life that carried within it the power to heal what was broken and restore what was lost. This is the God we serve. This is the nature of divine grace. When our plans crumble, He has better plans. When our hopes are shattered, He plants new hopes. When our families are torn apart by sin and tragedy, He provides ways to rebuild and restore. Seth's birth was the first great demonstration of this principle, but it certainly wouldn't be the last. Throughout Scripture, we see this pattern repeated again and again. When Abraham and Sarah were past the age of childbearing, God gave them Isaac. When the Israelites were enslaved in Egypt for 400 years, God raised up Moses. When Jerusalem was destroyed and the people were carried into exile, God promised restoration. When humanity was lost in sin with no way to save itself, God sent His Son. Seth's story teaches us that God specializes in impossible situations. He delights in bringing beauty from ashes, strength from weakness, victory from defeat. The appointment of Seth wasn't just about replacing Abel. It was about establishing a pattern of divine intervention that would characterize God's relationship with humanity throughout history. But let's dig even deeper into the spiritual significance of Seth's name and calling. The Hebrew word from which Seth derives doesn't just mean appointed or substituted. It carries connotations of setting in place, establishing firmly, founding securely. God wasn't just giving Eve a consolation prize. He was laying a foundation for the future of the world. This foundation wasn't built on human wisdom or strength. It wasn't established through political power or military might. It was founded on faith, sustained by worship, and strengthened through generations of faithful men and women who understood that their ultimate citizenship was in heaven, not earth. And here's something that will astound you. The foundation that Seth laid was so solid, so enduring, that it survived not just the corruption of his own generation, but the complete destruction of the world through flood. When every other family line was wiped out, when every other tradition was lost, when civilization itself was reset to zero, Seth's spiritual legacy lived on through Noah and his sons. This isn't just historical coincidence. This is divine preservation at work. God was protecting something precious, something essential, something that the world couldn't afford to lose. Through the darkest chapters of human history, through judgment and catastrophe, through the rise and fall of empires and civilizations, the spiritual heritage of Seth would endure. Think about the implications of this for your own life. If you're a believer in Jesus Christ, you're connected to this same spiritual lineage. You're part of the same covenant family that began with Seth's appointment. The faith that he pioneered, the worship that he established, the hope that he carried forward, these same realities are alive in you today. But there's more to Seth's story that we need to explore. His influence didn't end with his own generation, or even with the flood. The principles he established, the patterns he set in motion, these would be picked up and carried forward by the great figures of faith throughout biblical history. When Abraham left his homeland to follow God's call, he was walking in Seth's footsteps. When Moses stood before Pharaoh demanding freedom for God's people, he was continuing Seth's legacy of faithfulness. When David penned the Psalms that still inspire worship today, he was drawing from the same well of spiritual truth that Seth had first tapped. And when Jesus walked the dusty roads of Palestine, teaching about the kingdom of heaven and demonstrating God's love through miraculous signs, he was bringing to fulfillment everything that Seth's appointment had set in motion 2,000 years earlier. This is the untold story of Seth, not just the tale of Adam and Eve's third son, but the epic saga of how God weaves redemption through the most unlikely circumstances. It's the revelation of how a single appointment, made in the aftermath of history's first murder, would eventually lead to the salvation of the world. But perhaps the most extraordinary aspect of Seth's legacy lies in something that most biblical scholars have overlooked for centuries. Hidden within the genealogies and woven throughout the ancient texts are clues that point to Seth's role as the first guardian of divine revelation. You see, Seth didn't just carry forward genetic material or family traditions. He became the keeper of something far more precious than gold or silver. He became the protector of God's spoken word. Think about this for a moment. There were no written scriptures in Seth's time, no tablets of stone, no scrolls, no books. The only way divine truth could be preserved was through careful oral transmission from one generation to the next. And it was Seth's lineage that took on this sacred responsibility, becoming living libraries of heavenly knowledge. Ancient Jewish traditions, preserved in texts that predate the Christian era, speak of Seth receiving direct revelations from God. These weren't just casual conversations or fleeting visions. They were comprehensive downloads of divine truth that covered everything from the nature of creation to the plan of redemption. Seth became the first human theologian, the original keeper of sacred mysteries. But here's what makes this even more fascinating. Archaeological discoveries in recent decades have uncovered evidence of sophisticated knowledge systems existing in the ancient world, knowledge that seems to have appeared suddenly without any clear developmental process. Some scholars suggest this points to a common source, a single repository of wisdom that was later dispersed among various cultures. Could it be that Seth's family preserved not just spiritual truths, but also practical knowledge about astronomy, mathematics, engineering, and medicine? Could the famous wisdom of the ancients trace back to revelations given to Adam's appointed son? The biblical account certainly suggests that Seth's descendants possessed extraordinary understanding, living lives that spanned nearly a millennium and maintaining technologies that were lost in the flood. Now let me tell you something that will send shivers down your spine. According to ancient sources, Seth didn't just receive these revelations and keep them to himself. He established what we might call the first theological seminary, a systematic approach to training future generations in the ways of God. His sons and grandsons became students in the deepest mysteries of existence, learning not just facts but wisdom, not just information but transformation. Picture this scene. As the sun sets over the ancient landscape, Seth gathers his family around a fire. But this isn't just casual storytelling time. This is sacred instruction, divine education, the passing down of truths that could reshape civilizations. Children learn about the character of God, young adults discover their purpose in creation, and mature believers receive insights into prophecies yet to be fulfilled. These weren't dry lectures or boring religious ceremonies. These were dynamic encounters with living truth, sessions where heaven touched earth through the words of a man who walked intimately with his Creator. Each lesson built upon the previous one, creating a comprehensive understanding of reality that encompassed both seen and unseen worlds. And here's something remarkable. The Hebrew text suggests that Seth's teaching method was revolutionary. Rather than simply dictating information, he used what we might call experiential learning. His students didn't just hear about God's faithfulness, they experienced it. They didn't just learn about worship, they participated in it. They didn't just study prophecy, they lived in anticipation of its fulfillment. This educational approach would become the foundation for how divine truth would be transmitted throughout biblical history. Moses would use similar methods when teaching the Israelites. David would employ these principles when training the Levitical choirs. Jesus himself would adopt this hands-on approach when instructing his disciples. But Seth's influence extended far beyond teaching methods. He established patterns of spiritual formation that would echo through millennia. The concept of mentorship, where older believers guide younger ones in their faith journey, began with Seth. The practice of corporate worship, where communities gather to honor God together, was pioneered in his household. The tradition of prophetic revelation, where God speaks through chosen vessels to guide his people, was first demonstrated in his lineage. Yet there's an aspect of Seth's story that might be the most significant of all, though it's hidden in plain sight throughout the biblical narrative. Seth wasn't just preserving the past or maintaining the present. He was preparing for the future. Every lesson he taught, every tradition he established, every prayer he offered, was laying groundwork for something magnificent that was yet to come. You see, Seth understood something that his contemporaries missed. He grasped that history wasn't random, that events weren't accidental, that God was orchestrating a master plan that would unfold over thousands of years. And he knew that his role was to ensure that when the time came for that plan to reach its climax, humanity would be ready. This forward-thinking perspective shaped everything Seth did. When he named his children, he chose names that carried prophetic significance. When he established worship practices, he included elements that would prepare people for future revelations. When he preserved ancient stories, he emphasized themes that would find their ultimate fulfillment in the coming Messiah. Think about the profound faith this required. Seth was investing his entire life in promises he would never see fulfilled in his lifetime. He was building for a future he would never experience on earth. He was planting seeds that wouldn't bear their full fruit for dozens of generations. This wasn't just long-term thinking. This was eternal perspective in action. And God honored that faithfulness in ways that Seth could never have imagined. The spiritual infrastructure he established would become the foundation upon which every subsequent move of God would build. The temple worship that would later flourish in Jerusalem, it traced its roots back to practices Seth established. The prophetic schools that would train Elijah and Elisha, they followed patterns Seth pioneered. The synagogue system that would preserve Jewish faith through centuries of exile, it reflected principles Seth first articulated. But perhaps most importantly, the very concept of substitutionary sacrifice, the idea that one life could be given in place of another, was first demonstrated through Seth's appointment in place of Abel. This wasn't just a family arrangement or a social custom. It was a prophetic picture, a divine object lesson that would prepare humanity to understand the ultimate substitution that would one day take place on a hill called Calvary. Now here's where Seth's story intersects with something that will absolutely blow your mind. Recent archaeological discoveries have uncovered evidence of ancient civilizations that possessed knowledge far beyond what we would expect for their time period. Structures that required mathematical precision we've only recently achieved. Astronomical alignments that demonstrate understanding of cosmic cycles spanning thousands of years. Agricultural techniques that maximized crop yields in ways that modern science is just beginning to comprehend. Where did this knowledge come from? How did ancient people, supposedly primitive and uneducated, accomplish feats that challenge our modern assumptions about human development? Some researchers point to extraterrestrial intervention or lost civilizations. But what if the answer is far simpler and far more profound? What if the extraordinary wisdom of the ancients came from the same source as Seth's revelations? What if God, in his mercy, provided early humanity with knowledge and understanding that would help them not just survive, but thrive in a world marred by sin? What if the appointed son was also the appointed teacher, the chosen vessel through whom divine wisdom would flow into human civilization? This possibility transforms our understanding of ancient history. It suggests that the rapid advancement of early civilizations wasn't the result of gradual evolution or lucky discoveries, but of direct divine instruction channeled through faithful men and women who walk closely with their Creator. It means that Seth's influence extended far beyond spiritual matters into every aspect of human development. But there's another dimension to Seth's legacy that's even more remarkable. According to ancient traditions preserved in various cultures around the world, Seth's descendants didn't just receive knowledge, They were commissioned to spread it. They became the world's first missionaries, traveling to distant lands and sharing the wisdom they had received with people who had never heard of the one true God. This explains why we find similar stories, moral principles, and even scientific insights scattered throughout diverse ancient cultures that had no apparent contact with each other. The flood narrative appears in civilizations across every continent. The concept of a golden age followed by decline and the promise of restoration echoes through mythologies worldwide. The practice of sacrifice to appease divine wrath is virtually universal among ancient peoples. These weren't coincidences or parallel developments. They were echoes of truth originally revealed to Seth and his descendants, truth that was carried to the ends of the earth by faithful men and women who understood their responsibility to share divine wisdom with all humanity. The appointed Son had appointed missionaries, and through them, the light of truth penetrated even the darkest corners of the ancient world. As civilizations developed and languages diverged, as peoples scattered and cultures evolved, these original truths became distorted and corrupted. Pure monotheism devolved into polytheism. Clear moral principles became confused ethical systems. Accurate historical accounts transformed into mythological stories. But the core elements remained, buried beneath layers of human interpretation and cultural adaptation. This is why comparative religion reveals so many striking similarities between diverse faith systems. This is why archaeological discoveries keep uncovering evidence of advanced ancient knowledge. This is why even secular historians acknowledge that something extraordinary happened in the early development of human civilization. They're seeing the fingerprints of Seth's legacy, the lingering effects of divine revelation channeled through the appointed Son and his faithful descendants. But Seth's story doesn't end with ancient history. The principles he established, the patterns he set in motion, the foundation he laid, continues to shape our world today. Every time someone chooses faith over fear, worship over worldliness, eternal perspective over temporary pleasure, they're walking in Seth's footsteps. Every time a believer invests their life in something that will outlast their earthly existence, they're following Seth's example. And every time the gospel is preached, every time someone hears the good news that Jesus died as a substitute for sinful humanity, they're experiencing the ultimate fulfillment of what Seth's appointment foreshadowed thousands of years ago. The appointed Son was pointing toward the appointed Son, the substitute pointing toward the substitute, the second chance pointing toward the ultimate redemption. This is the untold story of Seth that most people never hear. It's not just about one man's life or one family's faith. It's about God's relentless pursuit of fallen humanity, his unwavering commitment to his redemptive purposes, and his incredible ability to bring beauty from ashes, hope from despair, and life from death. Through Seth, we learn that no tragedy is too great for God to overcome, no loss too devastating for him to restore, no darkness too deep for his light to penetrate. The appointed Son teaches us that God always has a plan, always provides a way, always offers hope to those who trust in his unfailing love. But there's still more to discover about Seth's extraordinary legacy. Connections that will challenge everything you thought you knew about biblical history and reveal truths that have been hidden in plain sight for thousands of years. The genealogical records preserved in ancient texts reveal something that will absolutely stagger you. Seth's bloodline didn't just survive through the flood, it became the exclusive carrier of messianic promise. When Noah stepped off the ark with his 3 sons, he carried within his genetic code the accumulated spiritual heritage of 20 generations of faithful men who had walked with God. But here's what most biblical scholars have completely missed. The blessing that Noah pronounced over his sons wasn't just a patriarchal benediction. It was a prophetic roadmap that traced the future of redemption through specific family lines. When he blessed Shem and declared that the God of Shem would be blessed, he was identifying which of his sons would carry forward Seth's sacred mission. Think about the mathematical precision of this divine plan. Out of millions of people who lived before the flood, only 8 survived. Out of those 8, only one family line was chosen to carry the messianic seed. Out of that line, only one son would be blessed with the covenant promise. The odds of this happening by random chance are astronomical, yet it unfolded exactly as God had predetermined. Now let me share something with you that will revolutionize your understanding of Old Testament history. Every major figure in biblical narrative, every patriarch and prophet, every king and priest, traces their lineage back to Seth through this carefully preserved bloodline. Abraham, the father of faith, was Seth's descendant. Moses, the great lawgiver, carried Seth's genetic heritage. David, the man after God's own heart, was part of Seth's family tree. But the preservation of this bloodline wasn't automatic or effortless. Throughout history, there were countless attempts to corrupt it, destroy it, or divert it from its intended purpose. Satan understood what was at stake. He knew that if he could eliminate Seth's descendants, he could prevent the coming of the Messiah and secure his victory over humanity. Consider the attacks that came against this bloodline throughout the centuries. Pharaoh's decree to kill all Hebrew male children was an attempt to wipe out the messianic line. Haman's plot to destroy the Jewish people was another assault on Seth's heritage. Herod's massacre of the innocents was a final desperate attempt to prevent the Appointed One from fulfilling his destiny. Yet through every crisis, through every persecution, through every seemingly impossible situation, the bloodline survived. Sometimes it was reduced to a single family, sometimes to just one individual, but it never completely disappeared. God's protective hand was always there, preserving what he had promised, maintaining the continuity that would eventually lead to Bethlehem. The preservation of Seth's lineage reveals something profound about God's character. He is not just faithful to keep his promises, he is strategic in how he fulfills them. Every generation of Seth's descendants played a crucial role in preparing the world for the Messiah's arrival. Every faithful man and woman in that bloodline added another thread to the tapestry of redemption. But here's something that will blow your mind. The influence of Seth's lineage extended far beyond the Jewish people. Through marriages, migrations, and missionary activities, the spiritual DNA of the appointed son spread throughout the ancient world. The wisdom traditions of Egypt, the philosophical insights of Greece, the legal principles of Rome, all show traces of truth that can be traced back to revelations originally given to Seth's family. This explains why we find messianic expectations in cultures that had no direct contact with Hebrew scripture. The Persian Magi who traveled to worship the infant Jesus weren't just following a star, they were acting on ancient knowledge that had been passed down through generations of truth seekers who had preserved fragments of Seth's original revelations. The Chinese concept of the mandate of heaven, the Hindu expectation of divine avatars, the Norse prophecies of Ragnarok followed by renewal, these weren't independent developments. They were corrupted echoes of the original promise given in Eden and preserved through Seth's faithful lineage. Humanity's universal longing for a savior wasn't coincidental. It was the result of ancient truth embedded in the collective memory of our species. Now, let me take you deeper into something that most people never consider. Seth's role as the appointed son wasn't just about genetic preservation or spiritual leadership. He was also the first human being to fully understand the cosmic dimensions of the battle between good and evil. Through divine revelation, he grasped truths about spiritual warfare that wouldn't be fully disclosed to humanity again until the New Testament era. Seth understood that the conflict between his family and Cain's descendants wasn't merely sociological or economic. It was fundamentally spiritual, representing two different approaches to existence itself. One approach sought to build a civilization independent from God, relying on human wisdom and strength. The other approach acknowledged dependence on divine guidance and sought to align human activity with heavenly purposes. This understanding shaped everything about how Seth raised his children and established his community. He didn't just teach them practical skills for survival, he trained them to recognize spiritual realities that others couldn't perceive. He didn't just pass down historical information, he equipped them to discern divine timing and participate in God's unfolding plan. The result was a family line that produced an extraordinary number of prophets, visionaries, and spiritual leaders. These weren't accidents of birth or lucky genetic combinations. They were the predictable result of generations of intentional spiritual formation, where each generation built upon the revelations and insights of those who came before. Consider Enoch's translation, Methuselah's prophetic longevity, Noah's prophetic preparation for the flood. These weren't isolated supernatural events. They were the natural outcome of a family culture that prioritized spiritual sensitivity above material success. Seth's descendants learned to hear God's voice because they lived in households where divine communication was normal and expected. But there's another aspect of Seth's legacy that's been hidden in plain sight throughout biblical history. The appointed son didn't just establish patterns of individual faithfulness, he created the first model of godly community. His household became the prototype for every subsequent move of God among his people. The principles that governed Seth's family would later be refined and codified in the Mosaic law. The worship practices they developed would eventually find their fullest expression in the tabernacle and temple services. The community structures they established would become the foundation for Israel's tribal organization, and later for the New Testament church. Think about what this means. When God gave Moses detailed instructions for constructing the tabernacle, he wasn't introducing entirely new concepts. He was formalizing and expanding worship principles that had been practiced in Seth's family for centuries. When David organized the Levitical choirs and established patterns of praise and worship, he was drawing from a well of spiritual tradition that traced back to the appointed son. Even more remarkably, when Jesus established the church and gave his disciples instructions for community life, he was restoring patterns that had originated in Seth's household thousands of years earlier. The early Christian emphasis on spiritual family, sacrificial love, and prophetic insight weren't revolutionary innovations. They were returns to the original design established by Adam's appointed son. This continuity reveals something breathtaking about God's redemptive plan. Nothing is wasted, nothing is forgotten, nothing is accidental. The principles that Seth pioneered in the aftermath of humanity's first murder would eventually be perfected in the community that formed around humanity's ultimate sacrifice. The appointed son's legacy would find its fulfillment in the appointed son's church. But let me share with you something that will absolutely astound you about the prophetic dimensions of Seth's story. Ancient Jewish texts preserve traditions that Seth received not just revelations about past events and present realities, but detailed visions of future history. He saw the rise and fall of empires, the coming of the Messiah, and even the ultimate restoration of creation itself. These visions weren't given for Seth's personal benefit or entertainment. They were strategic intelligence, divine downloads that would help him prepare his descendants for the challenges and opportunities they would face in the centuries ahead. Every generation of Seth's family had access to prophetic insight that helped them navigate their particular historical moment while maintaining focus on eternal priorities. This explains why Seth's descendants consistently made decisions that seemed counterintuitive from a human perspective, but proved to be divinely wise in the long run. They weren't just reacting to circumstances or following conventional wisdom. They were operating from prophetic knowledge that allowed them to see beyond immediate appearances to ultimate realities. When Abraham left his homeland to journey to an unknown destination, he was acting on prophetic insight that had been preserved in his family for generations. When Moses confronted Pharaoh despite overwhelming odds, he was drawing on spiritual knowledge that traced back to Seth's original revelations. When David faced Goliath with nothing but a sling and stones, he was operating from prophetic confidence that had been cultivated in his bloodline for centuries. The preservation of prophetic knowledge within Seth's lineage created what we might call a spiritual advantage that persisted throughout biblical history. While other peoples groped in spiritual darkness or relied on false prophets and demonic revelation, Seth's descendants had access to accurate information about God's character and plans. But this advantage came with tremendous responsibility. Those who knew the truth were accountable to live according to it and to pass it on faithfully to the next generation. The spiritual privilege of being in Seth's lineage was balanced by the spiritual pressure of maintaining that inheritance intact. This is why we see such dramatic consequences when individuals in the messianic line chose to compromise or rebel. When Solomon's heart turned away from God in his later years, it resulted in the division of the kingdom. When the kings of Judah led their people into idolatry, it brought exile and destruction. The appointed bloodline carried blessings, but it also carried heightened accountability. Yet through every failure, through every setback, through every apparent disaster, the core promise remained intact. God's commitment to bringing redemption through Seth's lineage was unshakable, even when individual members of that lineage proved unfaithful. The appointed son's legacy was ultimately dependent not on human faithfulness, but on divine determination. And here's something that will send chills down your spine. The same prophetic knowledge that guided Seth's descendants throughout Old Testament history continues to operate today. The church doesn't just possess the completed scriptures, it has inherited the prophetic legacy that began with the appointed son. Believers today have access to the same kind of divine insight that enabled Seth's family to navigate their challenging circumstances with supernatural wisdom. This means that the story of Seth isn't just ancient history, it's present reality. The principles he established, the patterns he set in motion, the spiritual DNA he passed down, these continue to shape and guide God's people in every generation. The appointed son's legacy lives on in every believer who chooses faith over fear, who prioritizes eternal values over temporal concerns, who invests their life in God's redemptive purposes. But there's still more to uncover about Seth's extraordinary impact on human history, connections that will challenge everything you thought you knew about the development of civilization, and reveal how the appointed son's influence shaped the very foundations of human society in ways that most people have never imagined. The archaeological record reveals something that secular historians struggle to explain, but makes perfect sense when viewed through the lens of Seth's story. The sudden appearance of sophisticated knowledge in ancient civilizations, the rapid development of complex social structures, the emergence of advanced technologies that seem to have no clear developmental path, all point to a common source of wisdom that was distributed throughout the ancient world. But this wasn't just practical knowledge about engineering or agriculture. The moral and ethical principles that formed the foundation of early legal codes, the spiritual insights that shaped the world's major religious traditions, the philosophical concepts that guided the development of human thought, these all show traces of truth that can be traced back to the revelations originally given to Seth and his descendants. Consider the Code of Hammurabi, one of the earliest known legal documents in human history. Its principles of justice, its concern for the protection of the weak, its emphasis on proportional punishment. These reflect moral insights that were first articulated in Seth's household and later codified in the Mosaic Law. The connection isn't coincidental, it's genealogical. The Egyptian concept of ma'at, the divine principle of truth and justice that was supposed to govern both earthly and heavenly realms, bears striking similarities to Hebrew understanding of God's righteous character. The Greek philosophical tradition that emphasized the pursuit of wisdom and virtue as the highest human calling echoes themes that were central to Seth's teaching. The Roman legal system that became the foundation for Western jurisprudence incorporated principles of justice that had their ultimate origin in divine revelation. This global distribution of truth fragments explains why we find universal moral principles across diverse cultures that had no apparent contact with each other: the prohibition against murder, the condemnation of theft, the importance of honesty, the value of compassion. These weren't independent discoveries by separate civilizations. They were echoes of the original moral law that had been revealed to humanity through Seth's lineage and then scattered throughout the world as his descendants migrated and intermarried with other peoples. But Seth's influence on human civilization extended beyond moral and legal principles. The appointed son's legacy can be traced through the development of art, music, literature, and architecture throughout history. The human impulse to create beauty, to express transcendent truths through creative endeavors, to build structures that reach toward heaven. These reflect the image of God that was preserved most clearly in Seth's family line. The great cathedrals of medieval Europe, the soaring temples of ancient Asia, the intricate manuscripts that preserved knowledge through dark ages, the musical compositions that lift the human spirit toward divine realities. All of these represent the flowering of creative impulses that were first cultivated in Seth's household and then spread throughout human culture. Even the scientific revolution that transformed the modern world can be traced back to principles that originated with the appointed son. The belief that the universe operates according to rational laws, the conviction that human beings can understand and work with these laws, the assumption that knowledge should be used for the benefit of humanity. These foundational concepts of scientific inquiry were first established in families that worshipped the God of order and purpose. The great scientists who laid the foundations of modern knowledge, men like Newton, Kepler, and Pascal, weren't just brilliant individuals who happened to make important discoveries. They were operating from worldview assumptions that had been shaped by centuries of biblical thought, assumptions that traced their ultimate origin back to the revelations given to Seth and preserved through his faithful descendants. This explains why the scientific revolution emerged primarily in cultures that had been influenced by biblical Christianity, rather than in civilizations dominated by other religious or philosophical traditions. It wasn't cultural superiority or genetic advantage that made the difference. It was the inheritance of intellectual and spiritual principles that had been planted by the appointed son and cultivated through generations of faithful believers. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Seth's continuing influence lies in something that most people never consider. The appointed son's legacy isn't just about past achievements or present realities. It's about future possibilities that are still unfolding as God's redemptive plan moves toward its ultimate climax. Every believer who dedicates their life to serving God's purposes, every missionary who carries the gospel to unreached peoples, every scholar who uses their knowledge to advance God's kingdom, every artist who creates beauty that reflects divine glory, every leader who governs with justice and compassion. All of these are continuing the work that Seth began thousands of years ago. The appointed son established a pattern of faithful living that would be replicated and refined throughout history as God's people learned to walk in covenant relationship with their Creator. Seth's legacy isn't just a historical curiosity or a theological concept. It's a living reality that continues to shape our world and will continue to do so until the day when God's redemptive plan reaches its final fulfillment. And that brings us to the most extraordinary truth about Seth's story, a revelation that ties together everything we've discovered about the appointed son and points us toward the ultimate purpose for which he was raised up in the first place. The legacy that began with his birth in the aftermath of tragedy would find its perfect fulfillment in another birth that would transform tragedy into triumph for all eternity. The threads of Seth's story converge on a single moment that would eclipse every other event in human history. When the angel Gabriel appeared to a young virgin named Mary in the obscure town of Nazareth, he wasn't just announcing the conception of another child. He was declaring that the promise carried through Seth's bloodline for 4,000 years was about to reach its magnificent climax. Think about the divine orchestration required to bring this moment to pass. Every generation of Seth's descendants had to survive. Every faithful man and woman in that lineage had to make the right choices at crucial moments. Every attack against the messianic bloodline had to be thwarted. Every prophetic word spoken through the centuries had to be fulfilled with perfect precision. The genealogy that Matthew carefully recorded in the opening chapter of his Gospel wasn't just a list of names. It was a testament to God's faithfulness across millennia. Each name represented a link in an unbroken chain that stretched from the Garden of Eden to the manger in Bethlehem. Each generation had played its part in preserving something more precious than gold or silver, the genetic and spiritual heritage that would make the incarnation possible. But here's something that will absolutely stagger you. When Jesus was born, he didn't just inherit Seth's genetic material. He inherited the accumulated spiritual authority that had been building in that bloodline for generations. Every act of faith by Seth's descendants, every moment of worship, every prophetic revelation, every demonstration of divine power, all of it was converging in the person of Christ. This is why Jesus could speak with such authority about spiritual realities. This is why he could command demons and they obeyed. Why he could calm storms and heal the sick. Why he could raise the dead and ultimately conquer death itself. He wasn't just operating in his divine nature as the Son of God. He was also drawing upon the spiritual inheritance that had been accumulated through centuries of faithful men and women who had walked with the Almighty. The miracles that Jesus performed weren't completely unprecedented. Elijah had raised the dead. Elisha had multiplied food. Moses had controlled the forces of nature. But these earlier demonstrations of divine power were just previews, glimpses of what would be possible when the fullness of God's power was channeled through a perfect human vessel who carried the complete spiritual DNA of Seth's appointed lineage. Now let me reveal something that will revolutionize how you understand the significance of Christ's sacrifice. When Jesus hung on the cross, bearing the sins of humanity, he wasn't just dying as an individual. He was dying as the representative of Seth's entire bloodline, carrying within himself the accumulated righteousness of every faithful person who had ever lived, and the accumulated guilt of every sinner who had ever been born. The substitutionary atonement that took place on Calvary was the ultimate fulfillment of the principle that had been demonstrated when Seth was appointed in place of Abel. Just as the appointed son had taken Abel's position in the family line, the appointed son would take humanity's position under divine judgment. The pattern established in Genesis found its perfect completion in the Gospels, but the connection between Seth and Jesus goes even deeper than substitution. It touches on something that theologians call federal headship, the idea that certain individuals represent entire groups of people in their actions and destinies. Adam had been the federal head of the human race, and his fall had brought condemnation upon all his descendants. Seth had become the federal head of the faithful remnant, and his righteousness had provided a pathway for redemption. Jesus, as the ultimate descendant of Seth's lineage, became the federal head of a new humanity, a redeemed people who would inherit eternal life rather than eternal death. His obedience would undo Adam's disobedience. His righteousness would overcome humanity's sinfulness. His victory would reverse the curse that had plagued creation since the fall. The Apostle Paul understood this connection when he wrote about Jesus as the second Adam. But he could have just as accurately called him the ultimate Seth, the final appointed son, the perfect substitute who would accomplish what all previous representatives had only foreshadowed. Every type and shadow in the Old Testament found its fulfillment in Christ, but none more perfectly than the appointment of Seth in place of his murdered brother. Yet, there's another dimension to this story that will leave you breathless with wonder. The resurrection of Jesus wasn't just about conquering death or validating his divine claims. It was about activating the spiritual inheritance that had been building in Seth's bloodline for millennia. When Christ rose from the dead, he didn't just secure eternal life for himself. He made that same life available to everyone who would believe in him. This is why the New Testament speaks about believers being born again, becoming new creatures, being adopted into God's family. When someone accepts Christ as their Savior, they're not just receiving forgiveness for their sins, they're being grafted into the spiritual lineage that began with Seth, gaining access to the same covenant blessings that had been preserved through centuries of faithful men and women. The church isn't just an organization or a religious movement, it's the continuation of Seth's family, the expansion of the appointed bloodline to include people from every nation and culture on earth. The Great Commission that Jesus gave to his disciples wasn't just about making converts, it was about extending the spiritual heritage of the appointed Son to the ends of the earth. Every person who comes to faith in Christ becomes part of this ancient story. They inherit the promises that were first given to Seth. They receive the spiritual authority that was accumulated through generations of faithful believers. They gain access to the same divine wisdom that guided the patriarchs and prophets throughout biblical history. But with this inheritance comes responsibility. Just as Seth's descendants were accountable to preserve and pass on what they had received, believers today are called to be faithful stewards of the spiritual legacy that has been entrusted to them. The appointed Son's mission continues through every generation of the church until the day when Christ returns to establish his eternal kingdom. And that brings us to something that will absolutely astound you about the future dimensions of Seth's story. The book of Revelation reveals that the spiritual principles established by the appointed Son will ultimately govern the entire universe. The new heaven and new earth that God will create won't be built on human wisdom or demonic deception. They'll be founded on the eternal truths that were first revealed to Seth and fully demonstrated through Jesus Christ. The city of God that John saw in his vision, with its walls of jasper and streets of gold, represents the ultimate fulfillment of the community that Seth began to build in the aftermath of Abel's murder. The worship that takes place around God's throne, with representatives from every tribe and nation singing praises to the Lamb, reflects the expansion of the worship practices that originated in Seth's household. Even the restoration of creation itself, when the curse is finally lifted and the earth is renewed, will vindicate the hope that sustained Seth's descendants through centuries of suffering and struggle. The appointed Son's faith in God's ultimate victory will be proven absolutely correct when Christ returns to claim his inheritance and establish his righteous rule over all creation. This cosmic perspective transforms how we understand Seth's legacy. He wasn't just the father of a family or the founder of a religious tradition. He was the pioneer of a way of life that would eventually become the governing principle of the entire universe. The values he championed, the truths he preserved, the faith he demonstrated. These will endure when every human kingdom has crumbled and every earthly achievement has been forgotten. But perhaps the most remarkable thing about Seth's continuing influence is how it operates in the present moment. Right now, as you hear these words, the spiritual DNA of the appointed Son is at work in your life if you're a believer in Christ. The same faith that sustained him through personal tragedy, the same hope that motivated him to invest in future generations, the same love that compelled him to worship God despite difficult circumstances. These same spiritual realities are available to you today. You don't have to wait for heaven to experience the blessings of Seth's legacy. You don't have to wonder if God's promises are true or if his plans will succeed. The appointed Son's story provides overwhelming evidence that God always keeps his word, always accomplishes his purposes, always brings beauty from ashes and life from death. When you face impossible circumstances, remember that Seth was born into impossible circumstances. When you wonder if your faith matters, remember that Seth's faith shaped the destiny of the world. When you question whether God can use your life for significant purposes, remember that the appointed Son started with nothing but divine appointment and ended up changing the course of human history. The principles that governed Seth's life are still operational today. God still appoints people for special purposes. He still brings good out of evil situations. He still uses ordinary individuals to accomplish extraordinary things. He still honors faithfulness, rewards obedience, and blesses those who walk in covenant relationship with Him. Your life is connected to this ancient story in ways you're probably just beginning to understand. The challenges you face, the opportunities you encounter, the decisions you make, all of these are part of the ongoing narrative that began when Seth was appointed in place of Abel. You're not just living your own individual story. You're participating in the greatest story ever told, the epic tale of God's redemptive love for fallen humanity. This is why Seth's story matters for believers today. It reveals the bigger picture, the eternal perspective, the ultimate purpose that gives meaning to every moment of your existence. You're not an accident or a mistake. You're not forgotten or overlooked. You're part of a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people belonging to God who have inherited the spiritual legacy of the appointed Son. The same God who raised up Seth in humanity's darkest hour is still raising up faithful men and women to carry forward His redemptive purposes. The same Spirit that guided the appointed Son's descendants through centuries of challenge and change is still at work in believers today. The same promises that sustained Seth's lineage through exile and persecution are still available to sustain God's people in every generation. But there's something else about Seth's legacy that you need to understand. Something that will equip you to live with confidence and purpose regardless of what circumstances you face. The appointed Son's story demonstrates that God's plans are never dependent on human strength or wisdom. They succeed because they're rooted in divine determination and powered by supernatural grace. Seth didn't earn his appointment through personal merit or exceptional ability. He received it as a gift of grace in the aftermath of family tragedy. His descendants didn't maintain their covenant status through perfect performance or flawless behavior. They preserved it through faith, repentance, and dependence on God's unfailing mercy. This means that your participation in God's redemptive plan isn't based on your qualifications or achievements. It's based on His calling and His grace. You don't have to be perfect to be used by God. You don't have to have everything figured out to make a significant contribution to His kingdom. You just have to be faithful with what He's given you and trust Him to accomplish His purposes through your obedience. The appointed Son's legacy continues today through every believer who chooses to walk by faith rather than by sight, who prioritizes eternal values over temporal concerns, who invests their life in things that will outlast their earthly existence. Seth's story is still being written through the lives of ordinary people who make extraordinary choices to serve the God of covenant and promise. And here's the most amazing truth of all. The story that began with Seth's appointment will reach its glorious conclusion when Jesus returns to establish His eternal kingdom. On that day, every faithful believer throughout history will be reunited in the presence of God. The appointed Son will meet the appointed Son. The substitute will worship the substitute. The promise will embrace the fulfillment. Can you imagine that moment? Can you picture the joy of Seth when he sees how his faithfulness in the aftermath of Abel's death contributed to the salvation of millions of people across thousands of years? Can you envision the celebration when the appointed Son realizes that his legacy didn't just survive, it triumphed in ways beyond his wildest dreams? That's the power of living with eternal perspective. That's the reward of investing in God's kingdom rather than earthly treasures. That's the hope that sustains believers through every trial and motivates them to persevere through every challenge. The appointed son's story reminds us that faithfulness always matters, that obedience always counts, that God always keeps his promises even when circumstances seem to suggest otherwise. But the implications of Seth's legacy extend beyond individual believers to the church as a whole. Understanding the appointed son's role in biblical history should transform how we see our corporate mission and identity. We're not just trying to build successful religious organizations or create impressive programs. We're continuing the work that Seth began, preserving and transmitting divine truth to future generations. This perspective should radically change how we approach ministry, evangelism, discipleship, and community life. We're not operating in isolation or starting from scratch. We're building on foundations that were laid thousands of years ago by faithful men and women who understood their role in God's eternal plan. The worship we offer connects us to the worship that began in Seth's household. The truth we proclaim echoes the revelations that were first given to the appointed son. The community we build reflects the patterns that were established in the aftermath of history's first murder. We're not just doing church, we're participating in a story that stretches from Eden to eternity. This understanding should fill us with both humility and confidence. Humility because we're stewards of something infinitely precious that was entrusted to us by previous generations of faithful believers. Confidence because the same God who preserved Seth's legacy through flood and famine, exile and persecution will also preserve the church until Christ returns to claim his bride. The appointed son story teaches us that God's purposes cannot be thwarted by human failure or spiritual opposition. They may be delayed or redirected, but they will never be defeated. The same power that raised Seth's lineage from the ashes of Abel's murder and brought forth the Messiah through centuries of faithful preservation is still at work in the church today. This means we can face the future with hope rather than fear, with faith rather than anxiety, with purpose rather than confusion. The God who appointed Seth in humanity's darkest hour is still appointing people for significant roles in his redemptive plan. The spirit that guided the appointed son's descendants through impossible circumstances is still available to guide believers through every challenge they face. Your life matters more than you realize. Your faithfulness has implications that extend far beyond what you can see. Your obedience contributes to a story that began before you were born and will continue long after you're gone. You're not just living for yourself or even for your family. You're participating in the greatest adventure in the universe, the ongoing saga of God's love for fallen humanity. Seth's appointment in place of Abel wasn't the end of tragedy or the solution to every problem, but it was proof that God never gives up on his people, never abandons his purposes, never stops working to bring redemption out of the most hopeless situations. The appointed son's legacy reminds us that no matter how dark the circumstances, no matter how impossible the odds, no matter how devastating the loss, God always has another move, always provides another way, always offers another chance. This is the untold story of Seth that most people never hear. The revelation that transforms tragedy into triumph, despair into hope, death into life. The appointed son's legacy continues today in every believer who chooses to walk by faith, and it will continue until the day when faith becomes sight, and the story that began in a garden reaches its glorious conclusion in the city of God. But there's still more to discover about how Seth's influence shaped not just biblical history, but the very foundations of human civilization in ways that most scholars have completely overlooked. The archaeological discoveries of recent decades have unveiled something that will absolutely revolutionize your understanding of ancient civilization. Hidden beneath layers of sand and centuries of silence, researchers have uncovered evidence of sophisticated knowledge systems that appeared suddenly in human history without any clear developmental process. advanced mathematical principles carved into stone tablets, astronomical calculations that demonstrate understanding of cosmic cycles spanning millennia, agricultural techniques that maximized crop yields in ways that modern science is only now beginning to comprehend. Where did this extraordinary wisdom originate? How did ancient peoples, supposedly primitive by our standards, accomplish feats of engineering and organization that challenge our modern assumptions about human development? Secular historians struggle to explain these phenomena, proposing theories about lost civilizations or extraterrestrial intervention. But what if the answer is far simpler and infinitely more profound than they imagine? What if the source of ancient wisdom was the same wellspring that sustained Seth's household for generations? What if the appointed son wasn't just preserving spiritual truths, but also serving as the conduit through which divine knowledge flowed into human civilization? Think about the implications of this possibility. It would mean that the rapid advancement of early societies wasn't the result of gradual evolution or fortunate discoveries, but of direct divine instruction channeled through faithful men and women who walked intimately with their Creator. This perspective transforms our understanding of how human civilization developed. It suggests that the knowledge that built the pyramids, the wisdom that governed ancient legal codes, the insights that shaped early philosophical systems, all trace their ultimate origin back to revelations first given to Seth and his descendants. The appointed son's influence extended far beyond his immediate family, into every aspect of human progress and development. But here's something that will send shivers down your spine. Ancient traditions preserved in cultures around the world speak of wise teachers who appeared in the earliest days of human history, bringing knowledge of agriculture, astronomy, medicine, and moral law to scattered tribes and emerging civilizations. These weren't mythological figures or legendary heroes. They were Seth's descendants, commissioned by God to carry divine wisdom to the ends of the earth. Picture this extraordinary mission unfolding across the ancient world. As populations grew and spread across continents, as languages began to diverge and cultures started to form distinct identities, faithful men and women from Seth's lineage traveled to distant lands. They weren't just migrants seeking better opportunities or traders pursuing commercial advantage. They were missionaries of truth, carriers of divine revelation, appointed ambassadors of the one true God. These early missionaries didn't just share spiritual insights. They brought practical knowledge that transformed entire societies. They taught agricultural techniques that increased crop yields and prevented famine. They introduced mathematical principles that enabled the construction of enduring monuments. They established legal frameworks that promoted justice and social stability. They preserved astronomical knowledge that allowed accurate calendar systems and navigation methods. This explains one of the greatest mysteries in the study of ancient civilizations. Why do we find similar stories, moral principles, and scientific insights scattered throughout diverse cultures that had no apparent contact with each other? The flood narrative appears in the traditions of peoples on every continent. The concept of a golden age followed by decline and the promise of restoration echoes through mythologies worldwide. The practice of sacrifice to appease divine displeasure is virtually universal among ancient societies. These weren't coincidences or independent discoveries. They were echoes of truth originally revealed to Seth and his descendants. Truth that was carried to every corner of the earth by faithful men and women who understood their responsibility to share divine wisdom with all humanity. The appointed son had appointed missionaries, and through them, the light of revelation penetrated even the darkest regions of the ancient world. As civilizations developed and evolved, as empires rose and fell, as cultures mixed and languages changed, these original truths became layered with human interpretation and cultural adaptation. Pure monotheism gradually devolved into complex polytheistic systems. Clear moral principles became confused, ethical philosophies. Accurate historical accounts transformed into elaborate mythological narratives. but the core elements remained, buried beneath centuries of human elaboration, yet still recognizable to those who knew what to look for. This is why comparative religion reveals such striking similarities between diverse faith traditions. This is why archaeological excavations keep uncovering evidence of advanced ancient knowledge that seems to have appeared without precedent. This is why even secular scholars acknowledge that something extraordinary happened in the early development of human civilization that defies conventional explanations. They're witnessing the fingerprints of Seth's legacy, the lingering effects of divine revelation that was channeled through the appointed son and then dispersed throughout the world by his faithful descendants, the wisdom that built ancient wonders, the moral insights that shaped early legal codes, the spiritual truths that form the foundation of world religions, all can be traced back to the revelations first given to Adam's third son in the aftermath of humanity's first murder. But Seth's influence on human development extends beyond practical knowledge and moral principles. The appointed son's legacy can be traced through the evolution of art, music, literature, and architecture throughout history. The human impulse to create beauty, to express transcendent truths through creative endeavors, to build structures that reach toward heaven. These reflect the image of God that was preserved most clearly in Seth's family line. Think about the great architectural achievements of the ancient world. The towering ziggurats of Mesopotamia reaching skyward like ancient prayers cast in stone. The majestic pyramids of Egypt, demonstrating mathematical precision that still amazes modern engineers. The intricate temples of Asia, adorned with carvings that tell stories of divine encounters and spiritual transformation. These weren't just impressive construction projects or displays of royal power. They were expressions of humanity's deepest longing for connection with the divine, impulses that were first cultivated in Seth's household and then spread throughout human culture. The development of written language itself bears the mark of Seth's influence. The earliest writing systems weren't invented merely for record-keeping or commercial transactions. They emerged from the need to preserve and transmit sacred knowledge, to ensure that divine revelations wouldn't be lost or corrupted as they passed from generation to generation. The appointed son's descendants understood that truth was too precious to trust to memory alone, so they pioneered methods of preserving it in permanent form. Consider the implications of this for understanding human creativity and cultural development. Every beautiful song that lifts the human spirit, every inspiring work of art that points toward transcendent truth, every architectural marvel that demonstrates the marriage of function and beauty, these all represent the flowering of creative impulses that were first cultivated in the household of the appointed son. The great cathedrals of medieval Europe, with their soaring spires and intricate stained glass windows, weren't just expressions of religious devotion. They were the culmination of centuries of architectural and artistic tradition that traced its ultimate origin back to the worship practices established by Seth. The magnificent manuscripts that preserved knowledge through dark ages, illuminated with gold leaf and decorated with elaborate borders, reflected the same reverence for divine truth that had motivated Seth's descendants to become careful stewards of sacred revelation. Even the musical traditions that have enriched human culture throughout history can be traced back to principles that originated with the appointed son. The use of music in worship, the understanding that harmony and rhythm could lift the human spirit toward divine realities, the recognition that creative expression could be a form of prayer. These concepts were first developed in Seth's community and then spread throughout the world as his descendants carried their traditions to distant lands. But there's another dimension to Seth's cultural influence that most people never consider. The appointed son's legacy shaped not just artistic and architectural achievements, but also the fundamental assumptions that would later make scientific inquiry possible. The belief that the universe operates according to rational laws, the conviction that human beings can understand and work with these laws, the assumption that knowledge should be used for the benefit of humanity. These foundational concepts of scientific investigation were first established in families that worshipped the God of order and purpose. The great scientists who laid the foundations of modern knowledge weren't just brilliant individuals who happened to make important discoveries. They were operating from worldview assumptions that had been shaped by centuries of biblical thought, assumptions that traced their ultimate origin back to the revelations given to Seth and preserved through his faithful descendants. Men like Newton, Kepler, Galileo, and Pascal weren't just investigating natural phenomena. They were thinking God's thoughts after him, exploring the rational structure of a universe created by divine intelligence. This explains why the scientific revolution emerged primarily in cultures that had been influenced by biblical Christianity, rather than in civilizations dominated by other religious or philosophical traditions. It wasn't cultural superiority or genetic advantage that made the difference. It was the inheritance of intellectual and spiritual principles that had been planted by the appointed Son and cultivated through generations of faithful believers who understood that studying God's creation was a form of worship. The mathematical principles that enabled precise calculations, the logical methods that allowed systematic investigation, the moral framework that insisted knowledge should serve human flourishing rather than merely satisfy curiosity. All of these essential components of scientific inquiry could be traced back through centuries of Christian scholarship to their ultimate source in the revelations first given to Seth and his descendants. Now let me reveal something that will absolutely stagger you about the prophetic dimensions of Seth's continuing influence. The appointed son's legacy isn't just about past achievements or present realities. It's about future possibilities that are still unfolding as God's redemptive plan moves toward its ultimate climax. Every believer who dedicates their life to advancing God's kingdom, every missionary who carries the gospel to unreached peoples, every scholar who uses their knowledge to serve divine purposes, every artist who creates beauty that reflects heavenly glory, all of these are continuing the work that Seth began in the aftermath of Abel's murder. The pattern of faithful living that the appointed Son established has been replicated and refined throughout history as God's people have learned to walk in covenant relationship with their Creator. Seth's legacy isn't just a historical curiosity or a theological concept. It's a living reality that continues to shape our world and will continue to do so until the day when God's redemptive plan reaches its magnificent fulfillment. This understanding should transform how you see your own role in the ongoing story of redemption. You're not just living an individual life disconnected from larger purposes. You're participating in a narrative that began with Seth's appointment and will culminate when Christ returns to establish his eternal kingdom. Every act of faithfulness, every moment of worship, every choice to prioritize eternal values over temporal concerns, these connect you to the same spiritual heritage that sustained the appointed Son through his trials and enabled his descendants to preserve divine truth through centuries of challenge and change. The threads of Seth's story that we've been tracing throughout history all converge on a single moment that would eclipse every other event in human experience. When the angel Gabriel appeared to Mary in Nazareth, announcing that she would conceive and bear a son who would be called the Son of the Most High, he wasn't just delivering news about another pregnancy. He was declaring that the promise carried through Seth's bloodline for 4 millennia was about to reach its glorious climax. Think about the divine orchestration required to bring this moment to pass. Every generation of Seth's descendants had to survive the perils of their particular historical moment. Every faithful man and woman in that lineage had to make the right choices at crucial crossroads. Every attack against the messianic bloodline had to be thwarted by divine intervention. Every prophetic word spoken through the centuries had to be fulfilled with absolute precision. The genealogy that Matthew carefully recorded in the opening chapter of his Gospel wasn't just a list of names to establish Jesus' legal right to David's throne. It was a testament to God's faithfulness across millennia, a demonstration of how the appointed Son's legacy had been preserved through flood and famine, war and exile, persecution and apostasy. Each name represented a vital link in an unbroken chain that stretched from the Garden of Eden to the stable in Bethlehem. But here's something that will leave you breathless with wonder. When Jesus was born, he didn't just inherit Seth's genetic material or even his spiritual legacy. He inherited the accumulated authority that had been building in that bloodline for generations. Every act of faith by Seth's descendants, every moment of authentic worship, every prophetic revelation, every demonstration of divine power, all of it was converging in the person of Christ. This is why Jesus could speak with such unparalleled authority about spiritual realities. This is why demons fled at his command and storms calmed at his word. This is why he could heal the sick with a touch and raise the dead with a spoken word. He wasn't just operating in his divine nature as the eternal Son of God. He was also drawing upon the spiritual inheritance that had been accumulated through centuries of faithful men and women who had walked intimately with the Almighty. The miracles that Jesus performed weren't completely without precedent in biblical history. Elijah had raised the dead and called down fire from heaven. Elisha had multiplied food and healed the sick. Moses had parted waters and commanded plagues. But these earlier demonstrations of divine power were just previews, glimpses of what would be possible when the fullness of God's presence was channeled through a perfect human vessel who carried the complete spiritual heritage of Seth's appointed lineage. Now prepare yourself for a revelation that will revolutionize how you understand the significance of Christ's sacrifice on the cross. When Jesus hung between heaven and earth, bearing the sins of humanity in his own body, he wasn't just dying as an individual man. He was dying as the representative of Seth's entire bloodline, carrying within himself the accumulated righteousness of every faithful person who had ever lived, and the accumulated guilt of every sinner who had ever been born. The substitutionary atonement that took place on Calvary was the ultimate fulfillment of the principle that had been demonstrated when Seth was appointed in place of his murdered brother. Just as the appointed son had taken Abel's position in the family line, the appointed son would take humanity's position under divine judgment. The pattern established in Genesis found its perfect completion in the passion narratives of the Gospels. But the connection between Seth and Jesus transcends mere substitution. It touches on the profound theological concept of federal headship, the idea that certain individuals represent entire groups of people in their actions and destinies. Adam had been the federal head of the human race, and his disobedience had brought condemnation upon all his descendants. Seth had become the federal head of the faithful remnant, and his righteousness had provided a pathway for redemption to flow through history. Jesus, as the ultimate descendant of Seth's lineage and the perfect fulfillment of everything the appointed son represented, became the federal head of a new humanity. His obedience would undo Adam's disobedience. His righteousness would overcome humanity's accumulated sinfulness. His victory would reverse the curse that had plagued creation since the moment when sin first entered the world through disobedience in Eden. The Apostle Paul grasped this connection when he wrote about Jesus as the second Adam, the new representative of humanity who would succeed where the first Adam had failed. But he could have just as accurately called Christ the ultimate Seth, the final appointed son, the perfect substitute who would accomplish what all previous representatives had only foreshadowed through their faithful lives and sacrificial service. Every type and shadow in the Old Testament found its fulfillment in Christ, but none more perfectly than the appointment of Seth in place of his murdered brother. The pattern of divine grace that chose the appointed Son to carry forward the covenant promise reached its ultimate expression when God chose Jesus to carry forward the salvation of the world. Yet there's another dimension to this magnificent story that will fill your heart with inexpressible joy. The resurrection of Jesus wasn't just about conquering death or validating his divine claims, though it certainly accomplished both of those purposes. It was about activating the spiritual inheritance that had been building in Seth's bloodline for thousands of years. When Christ rose from the dead, he didn't just secure eternal life for himself. He made that same life available to everyone who would believe in his name and trust in his finished work. This is why the New Testament speaks about believers being born again, becoming new creations, being adopted into God's eternal family. When someone accepts Christ as their Savior and Lord, they're not just receiving forgiveness for their sins or escaping divine judgment. They're being grafted into the spiritual lineage that began with Seth's appointment, gaining access to the same covenant blessings that had been preserved through centuries of faithful men and women who trusted in God's promises, even when circumstances seemed to contradict them. The church isn't just a religious organization or a social movement created by human enthusiasm. It's the continuation of Seth's family, the expansion of the appointed bloodline to include people from every nation, tribe, and culture on earth. The Great Commission that Jesus gave to his disciples before his ascension wasn't just about making converts or building religious institutions. It was about extending the spiritual heritage of the appointed Son to the uttermost parts of the earth. Every person who comes to faith in Christ becomes part of this ancient and ongoing story. They inherit the promises that were first given to Seth in the aftermath of tragedy. They receive access to the spiritual authority that was accumulated through generations of faithful believers. They gain the same divine wisdom that guided patriarchs and prophets throughout biblical history. They become heirs of the same covenant that sustained God's people through every trial and triumph recorded in Scripture. But with this incredible inheritance comes profound responsibility. Just as Seth's descendants were accountable to preserve and faithfully transmit what they had received, believers today are called to be careful stewards of the spiritual legacy that has been entrusted to them. The appointed Son's mission continues through every generation of the church until the glorious day when Christ returns to establish his eternal kingdom and bring this age to its triumphant conclusion. And that brings us to something that will absolutely astound you about the future dimensions of Seth's extraordinary story. The book of Revelation unveils that the spiritual principles established by the appointed Son will ultimately govern the entire universe. The new heaven and new earth that God will create after the final judgment won't be built on human wisdom or demonic deception. They'll be founded on the eternal truths that were first revealed to Seth and fully demonstrated through the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. The holy city that John saw in his apocalyptic vision, descending from heaven like a bride adorned for her husband, represents the ultimate fulfillment of the community that Seth began to build in the aftermath of his brother's murder. The worship that takes place around God's throne, with representatives from every people group singing praises to the Lamb who was slain, reflects the global expansion of the worship practices that originated in Seth's faithful household. Even the restoration of creation itself, when the curse is finally lifted and the earth is renewed in righteousness, will vindicate the hope that sustained Seth's descendants through centuries of suffering and struggle. The appointed Son's faith in God's ultimate victory will be proven absolutely correct when Christ returns in glory to claim his inheritance and establish his righteous rule over all creation. This cosmic perspective should transform how we understand the significance of Seth's legacy for our daily lives. He wasn't just the father of a family or the founder of a religious tradition. He was the pioneer of a way of life that will eventually become the governing principle of the entire universe. The values he championed, the truths he preserved, the faith he demonstrated, these will endure when every human kingdom has crumbled to dust and every earthly achievement has been forgotten by history. But perhaps the most remarkable truth about Seth's continuing influence lies in how it operates in your life right at this very moment. As you process these revelations about the appointed Son, as you begin to grasp the magnitude of his legacy, you're experiencing something that connects you directly to that ancient bloodline of faith. The same spirit that guided Seth through his darkest hours, the same divine wisdom that sustained his descendants through impossible circumstances, the same covenant promises that carried them through centuries of trial and triumph. All of these spiritual realities are actively at work in your life today. You don't have to wait for some future blessing or heavenly reward to tap into Seth's inheritance. You don't have to wonder whether God's promises are reliable or whether his plans will ultimately succeed. The appointed son's story provides overwhelming evidence that the Almighty always keeps his word, always accomplishes his purposes, always brings beauty from ashes and life from the most devastating circumstances. When you encounter situations that seem impossible to overcome, remember that Seth was born into circumstances that appeared equally hopeless. When you question whether your faith makes any real difference in a world dominated by darkness, remember that Seth's faith literally shaped the destiny of human civilization. When you wonder if God can use your ordinary life for extraordinary purposes, remember that the appointed son started with nothing but divine calling and ended up changing the trajectory of eternity itself. The principles that governed Seth's approach to life remain just as powerful today as they were 4,000 years ago. The Creator still appoints people for special purposes that they may not even fully understand at the time. He still brings tremendous good out of the most evil situations. He still uses ordinary individuals who are willing to trust him to accomplish things that will astound future generations. He still honors faithfulness above talent, rewards obedience over intelligence, and blesses those who choose to walk in covenant relationship with him rather than pursuing their own agenda. Your life is woven into this ancient narrative in ways that you're probably only beginning to comprehend. The challenges you face aren't random obstacles or meaningless suffering. They're part of the ongoing story that began when Seth was appointed to replace Abel. The opportunities that come your way aren't lucky breaks or coincidental timing. They're divine appointments that connect to purposes larger than anything you could orchestrate on your own. The decisions you make today don't just affect your immediate circumstances or even your lifetime achievements. They contribute to a legacy that stretches backward to Eden and forward to eternity. You're not simply living your individual story in isolation from everyone else. You're participating in the greatest narrative ever told, the epic saga of God's relentless pursuit of fallen humanity and his determination to restore what was broken by sin. This perspective should revolutionize how you approach every aspect of your existence. Your work isn't just a way to earn money or build a career. It's an opportunity to demonstrate kingdom principles in secular environments. Your relationships aren't just personal connections or social networks. They're channels through which divine love can flow to touch lives that desperately need hope. Your struggles aren't just problems to solve or burdens to bear. They're platforms for displaying God's faithfulness to a watching world. Think about how this understanding should transform your prayer life. When you pray, you're not just asking for personal favors or trying to manipulate circumstances in your favor. You're participating in conversations that have been ongoing since Seth first called upon the name of the Lord. You're adding your voice to a chorus of worship that began in the appointed son's household and will continue throughout eternity. Your prayers connect you to every faithful believer who has ever lived. When you intercede for your family, you're standing in the same spiritual position that Seth occupied when he prayed for his descendants. When you worship God in spirit and truth, you're joining the same kind of authentic praise that sustained his lineage through centuries of testing. When you seek divine guidance for important decisions, you're accessing the same wisdom that enabled the appointed son's family to navigate their complex historical circumstances. But prayer isn't the only area where Seth's legacy should impact your daily experience. Consider how his story should influence your approach to relationships and community building. The appointed son understood that individual faithfulness wasn't enough to preserve divine truth through the generations. He had to create a culture, establish patterns, build systems, that would outlast his own lifetime and continue functioning long after he was gone. This means that your commitment to following Christ shouldn't be purely private or entirely personal. Like Seth, you have a responsibility to influence your environment, to shape the spiritual climate around you, to invest in relationships that will multiply your impact beyond what you could accomplish alone. The appointed son's legacy reminds us that kingdom work is always community work, that lasting change happens through families and groups rather than isolated individuals. How does this play out in practical terms? It means choosing friends who will strengthen your faith rather than undermine it. It means building a marriage that reflects God's covenant love rather than cultural expectations about romance. It means raising children who understand their connection to this ancient story rather than just trying to help them succeed in worldly terms. It means participating in a local church that takes seriously its role as part of the ongoing mission that Seth pioneered thousands of years ago. The appointed son's example also provides crucial guidance for how to handle suffering and disappointment. Remember that Seth's entire identity was forged in the aftermath of tragedy. He didn't become a great man of faith despite experiencing family trauma. He became great partly because of how he responded to circumstances that could have destroyed his trust in God's goodness. Seth could have allowed bitterness over Abel's death to poison his relationship with the Almighty. He could have resented being given a role he never asked for. He could have questioned whether God really cared about human suffering or whether divine promises could be trusted in a world where innocent people died violent deaths. Instead, he chose to see his appointment as an opportunity rather than a burden, as a calling rather than a consolation prize. This pattern provides a template for how believers should process their own painful experiences. Every loss you suffer, every dream that gets shattered, every relationship that disappoints you, every plan that falls apart, all of these can become raw material for God to use in accomplishing His purposes through your life. The key isn't avoiding difficulty or trying to understand why bad things happen. The key is learning to trust that the same God who brought redemption through Seth's story can bring redemption through yours. But there's another dimension to Seth's legacy that speaks directly to believers living in the 21st century. The appointed son lived during a time when the world around him was becoming increasingly corrupt and violent. The culture that emerged from Cain's descendants was technologically advanced, but spiritually bankrupt. They could build cities and create instruments and develop weapons, but they had lost touch with their Creator and with the moral principles that make civilization sustainable. Does this sound familiar? We're living in an era that bears striking resemblance to the world that Seth inhabited. Our technological capabilities have reached levels that would have seemed magical to previous generations. We can communicate instantly across continents, travel faster than sound, manipulate matter at the molecular level, even extend human life far beyond what was once thought possible. Yet our moral foundations seem to be crumbling. Our social institutions are under unprecedented strain, and many people report feeling more isolated and purposeless than ever before. In such an environment, Seth's example becomes incredibly relevant. He didn't withdraw from society or try to escape to some isolated community where he could avoid contamination from the surrounding culture. He didn't spend his time complaining about how much worse things were getting or lamenting the good old days when people supposedly had better values. Instead, he focused on building something positive, something that would outlast the temporary chaos and confusion around him. The appointed son created an alternative culture within the broader civilization, a community that operated by different principles and pursued different goals than the mainstream society. His household became a sanctuary where divine truth was preserved, where worship was practiced, where children learned to see the world through God's eyes rather than accepting the assumptions that dominated their historical moment. This is exactly what the church needs to do in our current cultural climate. Rather than simply reacting to negative trends or trying to fight political battles that may or may not be winnable, believers should be proactively building communities that demonstrate what life looks like when it's organized around eternal rather than temporal values. We need to create environments where people can experience authentic relationships, discover their divine purpose, and learn to walk in the power of the Spirit. Seth's descendants didn't just survive the corruption of their generation, they thrived in spite of it. They lived longer, achieved more, and left a greater legacy than their contemporaries because they stayed connected to the source of life and wisdom. The same potential exists for believers today who are willing to prioritize their relationship with God above conformity to cultural expectations. This doesn't mean becoming weird or irrelevant or out of touch with contemporary realities. Seth's family wasn't disconnected from their society. They were deeply engaged with it, but they engaged from a position of spiritual strength rather than weakness. They had something to offer that their neighbors desperately needed, and they offered it with confidence because they knew it worked. The appointed sons approach provides a blueprint for how Christians can maintain their distinctiveness while still being effective ambassadors for Christ in a pluralistic world. The key is being so grounded in divine truth, so secure in your identity as God's beloved child, so convinced of the superiority of kingdom principles that you can interact with anyone without fear of being corrupted or compromised. But Seth's legacy speaks to more than just cultural engagement. His story also provides guidance for how to think about success and significance in a world that measures both primarily in terms of wealth, fame, and power. By worldly standards, the appointed son might not have seemed particularly impressive. He didn't build cities like Cain's descendants. He didn't accumulate vast material possessions or command armies or rule over territories. Yet Seth's influence ultimately proved far more enduring and significant than anything accomplished by his more visible contemporaries. The cities that Cain built eventually crumbled into ruins. The technologies developed by his descendants were swept away by the flood. The political structures they created collapsed under their own corruption. But the spiritual infrastructure that Seth established not only survived every catastrophe, it provided the foundation for everything good that followed in human history. This perspective should liberate believers from the pressure to achieve worldly success as a way of validating their faith or proving their worth. The appointed son's example demonstrates that the most important work often happens behind the scenes, in relationships rather than institutions, through influence rather than authority. The legacy that matters most isn't measured in dollars or degrees or public recognition. It's measured in lives transformed, truth preserved, and kingdom principles planted in hearts that will carry them into future generations. Seth understood something that many contemporary Christians seem to have forgotten. The goal isn't to become famous or wealthy or powerful according to worldly definitions. The goal is to be faithful to your divine calling, to invest your life in things that will outlast your earthly existence, to participate in God's redemptive work, regardless of whether you receive credit or recognition for your contribution. This doesn't mean being passive or avoiding responsibility or refusing to use your gifts to their fullest potential. The appointed son was incredibly active and engaged with his world, but he measured success differently than his contemporaries. He was playing a longer game, investing in outcomes that wouldn't be fully visible until centuries after his death. The same opportunity exists for believers today. You can choose to live for applause that fades quickly or for approval that lasts forever. You can invest your time and energy in building temporary monuments to your own achievement, or you can plant seeds that will bear fruit long after you've graduated to glory. You can pursue recognition from people who will forget you within a generation, or you can seek the approval of the one who will remember your faithfulness throughout eternity. Seth's story reveals that the most satisfying life isn't necessarily the most celebrated life. The appointed son found deep joy and meaning in his role, even though it required him to live primarily for the benefit of future generations rather than immediate gratification. He understood that true fulfillment comes from aligning your life with God's purposes rather than pursuing your own agenda. This understanding should transform how you approach major decisions about career, relationships, finances, and ministry involvement. Instead of asking primarily what will make you happy or successful in the short term, you can learn to ask what will advance God's kingdom and contribute to the legacy you want to leave behind. Instead of being driven by cultural expectations or peer pressure, you can be guided by eternal principles that have proven their worth across millennia. The appointed son's example also provides crucial insight into how to maintain hope during seasons when it seems like evil is winning and righteousness is being overwhelmed by corruption. Seth lived through a period when violence was increasing, when moral standards were declining, when it appeared that Cain's philosophy of life was triumphing over Abel's approach to worship and service. It would have been easy for the appointed son to become discouraged, to wonder whether his commitment to faithfulness was making any real difference, to question whether God's promises could be trusted in a world that seemed to be spiraling toward judgment. Yet Seth persevered because he understood that his role wasn't to single-handedly turn around the moral trajectory of his entire generation. His job was to preserve what could be preserved, to prepare what could be prepared, to plant what could be planted for future harvest. This perspective is desperately needed in our current historical moment. Many believers are feeling overwhelmed by the pace of cultural change, discouraged by the apparent triumph of values that contradict biblical principles, uncertain about whether their faith makes any practical difference in a world that seems increasingly hostile to Christian influence. Seth's story reminds us that God's people have faced similar challenges before and not only survived, but ultimately triumphed. The appointed son's faithfulness during his dark hour contributed to outcomes that he could never have imagined during his lifetime. The seeds he planted eventually produced a harvest that included the birth of the Messiah and the salvation of countless souls across history. Your faithfulness during this challenging season may seem small and insignificant compared to the magnitude of the problems around you. But remember that Seth's contribution also seemed modest at the time. One man, one family, one commitment to walk with God in the midst of a corrupt generation. Yet that apparently small beginning eventually changed the entire trajectory of human history. The same potential exists in your situation. The prayers you pray, the truth you speak, the love you demonstrate, the integrity you maintain, the worship you offer, all of these seemingly small acts of faithfulness are contributing to outcomes that won't be fully visible until eternity. You're not just living your individual life in isolation, you're participating in the same ongoing story that Seth pioneered, adding your chapter to a narrative that began with divine appointment and will culminate in divine triumph. This understanding should fill you with both humility and confidence. Humility because you're part of something infinitely larger than yourself, carrying forward a legacy that was entrusted to you by countless previous generations of faithful believers. Confidence because the same God who sustained Seth through his trials, who preserved his bloodline through flood and famine, who brought forth the Messiah from his descendants, is still actively at work in your life and circumstances. The appointed son's story teaches us that no situation is too desperate for God to redeem, no loss too devastating for him to restore, no darkness too deep for his light to penetrate. Seth was raised up in humanity's darkest hour to carry hope forward into an uncertain future. That same hope is available to you today, not because of your own strength or wisdom, but because of the faithfulness of the one who appointed him and who has appointed you for such a time as this. As we near the end of our exploration into Seth's remarkable legacy, there's one final truth that ties together everything we've discovered about the appointed son and his continuing influence on our world. The story that began with his birth in the aftermath of tragedy won't reach its conclusion until every promise made to his bloodline finds its perfect fulfillment in the return of Jesus Christ and the establishment of his eternal kingdom. This means that you're not just studying ancient history or exploring theological concepts when you learn about Seth. You're discovering your own spiritual heritage and gaining insight into your role in the final chapters of the greatest story ever told. The appointed Son's legacy lives on in every believer who chooses to walk by faith rather than by sight, who prioritizes eternal values over temporal concerns, who invests their life in things that will outlast their earthly existence. The same spirit that guided Seth through his challenges is available to guide you through yours. The same promises that sustained his descendants through centuries of testing are still in effect for God's people today. The same hope that motivated the appointed Son to invest in future generations rather than seeking immediate gratification can motivate you to make choices that will echo through eternity. But more than that, you have advantages that Seth never possessed during his earthly lifetime. You live on the other side of Calvary, where the ultimate sacrifice has already been made. You have access to the completed scriptures, where God's full revelation has been preserved in written form. You're part of the global church, where believers from every nation can encourage and strengthen one another in their faith. Most importantly, you know how the story ends. Seth lived by faith in promises that he would never see fulfilled in his lifetime. He invested in outcomes that wouldn't be visible for thousands of years. He trusted in a plan that was still largely hidden from human understanding. But you have the privilege of seeing how his faithfulness contributed to the coming of Christ, how his legacy was preserved through every challenge, how his trust in God's ultimate victory was completely vindicated by subsequent events. This knowledge should inspire you to similar faithfulness in your own generation. If Seth could remain loyal to God's calling without seeing the end result, how much more should you be willing to trust and obey when you know with certainty that every divine promise will eventually be fulfilled? If the appointed Son could invest his life in future generations without knowing exactly how his contribution would matter, how much more confidently can you make similar investments when you understand the eternal significance of faithful living? The untold story of Seth isn't really untold anymore. Through our exploration of his life and legacy, through our discovery of his continuing influence on human history, through our understanding of how his appointment in place of Abel foreshadowed the ultimate substitution accomplished by Christ, we've uncovered truths that can transform how you see yourself, your circumstances, and your calling as a follower of Jesus. You are connected to this ancient story in ways that should fill you with wonder and motivate you to excellence. The appointed Son's spiritual DNA flows through your life as a believer. His commitment to faithfulness provides a model for your own choices. His trust in God's ultimate victory gives you confidence to persevere through any challenge. His investment in future generations reminds you that your life has significance far beyond what you can see or measure in temporal terms. The legacy that began with Seth's birth will continue through your faithfulness and find its ultimate fulfillment when Christ returns in glory. Until that magnificent day arrives, you have the privilege of carrying forward the same mission that the appointed Son pioneered 4,000 years ago. You get to preserve divine truth, demonstrate kingdom principles, and invest in outcomes that will matter throughout eternity. This is your calling, your heritage, and your hope. This is the untold story of Seth, and now it's your story too.